Today, we are taking a look at 5 of the most terrifying true alien stories from the Joe Rogan Experience Podcast. Starting with the Joe Rogan Experience number 2318, featuring Harold Sonny White. Harold White is a mechanical and aerospace engineer and amplified physicist known for his pioneering work in advanced propulsion systems, particularly concepts related to faster than light travel. Now, on this episode of the JRE Podcast, Harold White talks to Joe about the Rendlesham Forest incident and how the UFO that was identified in that forest was nothing like he has ever seen. Now, if you guys are not familiar with the Rendlesham Forest incident, it's basically one of the most famous UFO events to ever occur in the United Kingdom. On November 26, 1980, US Air Force personnel reported seeing strange lights descending into Rendlesham Forest. Now, at first, the Air Force personnel believed that it was a downed aircraft, so several servicemen entered the forest and stumbled upon something extraterrestrial. Apparently, the object they found was a glowing metallic object. It was about 2 to 3 meters wide, and it was hovering on the ground. Now, the object reportedly had strange symbols, similar to, like hieroglyphics. When these servicemen approached the object, it shot off into the trees and then disappeared. And then on December 28th, 1980, 2 nights after the object was spotted, Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt led a group into the forest to investigate. Halt recorded the events on a cassette tape known as the Halt tape, and he described flashing red lights in the trees, a beam of light being directed at the Air Force base, and physical traces on the ground, including triangular indentations and radiation readings at anomalous levels. After that night, a memo from Halt to the UK Ministry of Defense titled Unexplained Lights detailed the incident and became a key piece of evidence for UFO researchers. The Ministry of Defense ultimately concluded that this object posed no threat to national security and stopped investigating it. Now, this incident baffles Harold White because the UFO was described as having a triangular base, strange symbols on it, and it allegedly emitted a blue and white light from it. That description, at the time, was very unique. Most alleged UFO sightings describe the aircrafts to either be cube-like or circular, so to Harold White, this craft that was seen in the Rendlesham Forest was something that really confused him. Now, Joe tells a story from a man who lived near the Rendlesham Forest, who was actually questioned by military personnel about the craft. Take a listen.
But when you hear what happened in that Rendlesham Forest thing, it breaks all of my guessing machine, and I it's like,
what is the story?
It's a colonel and some airmen reported some weird stuff that was going on in Rendlesham Forest. Yeah, and they went out and tried to investigate it, and they saw some. Again, I'm doing such a terrible job of summarizing it because I don't really know the lore very well. But
Victor Thurnkettle was out chopping wood one morning in Rendlesham Forest in late December 1980 when a car drew up. Out stepped 2 men, aged about 30, dressed in suits. "Good morning. Do you mind if we ask you some questions?" asked one in a well-spoken English accent. Earlier, on 26 and 28 of December, United States Air Force security personnel stationed at nearby RAF Woodbridge had reported seeing strange lights in the surrounding forest. Forestry worker Mr. Thurnkettle, unannounced and unidentified visitors, asked if he had been out the previous night. I said no, he recalls. They said, "Did you leave the house at all? Did you see anything?" I said, "What?" They said, "Oh, there's a report of some red lights in the forest. We're just checking." And the 2 men, very politely but firmly, asked me probably about 20 questions. I thought they were journalists. 3 years later, however, sightings made the News of the World front page story. It proclaimed UFO lands in Suffolk, and that's official. The story was based on a memo from RAF Woodbridge Deputy Base Commander Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt to the Ministry of Defense. It was released by the U.S. government, described as an encounter with an apparent UFO in the forest. Since then, the sightings have been the source of much debate and speculation among UFO enthusiasts and the subject of numerous books, articles, and TV programs. In March, a documentary concluded the sightings had achieved legend status like the Loch Ness or King Arthur. The forest even has its own official UFO trail, complete with a life-size replica.
That gets into the stuff that it doesn't make sense in terms of what they describe the UFO doing. It's just very peculiar, right? So
I want to really quickly take a look at some of the theories surrounding the Rendlesham Forest incident, just because there are a few theories that could explain what happened in that forest. So first, there's the obvious theory that what they saw in the forest was in fact an extraterrestrial craft, and it was a genuine alien spacecraft that landed or hovered in Rendlesham Forest. Now, this theory is of course supported by multiple credible military witnesses who all described a metallic triangular craft with symbols and unnatural light. There was physical evidence such as landing marks, radiation spikes, and scorched trees. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Halt has also publicly stated that he believes the craft was not of this world, and his tape recording and memo to the Ministry of Defense lend credibility. Now, the only real skepticism of this theory is that there were no photographs or videos taken of this craft, despite, there being multiple witnesses. And also the physical evidence, such as the landing marks, radiation spikes, and the torched trees, could have, natural explanations. Now, the second theory, known as the Orford Nest theory, is that the Orford Nest lighthouse, which flashes every 5 seconds, was mistaken for a UFO. The support around this theory is that the lighthouse was visible from the forest and is aligned with the direction of the reported lights. Halt's tape mentions a pulsing light through the trees at regular intervals, which, matches the lighthouse's flash rate. But of course, there is a ton of skepticism. Like, one, the witnesses of this craft were trained military observers, and it is highly unlikely that they were to confuse a lighthouse for a, hovering UFO. The object was also reportedly seen moving and emitting beams of light, which is not at all consistent with a stationary lighthouse. Now, the third theory is that the UFO was actually a classified US or British military project, such as a drone, a stealth aircraft, or, some sort of psychological warfare test. And I mean, this theory is supported by the Ministry of Defense's apparent, lack of concern over the object. That could mean that the Ministry of Defense may have had internal awareness of the origin of the craft, and that's why they decided not to investigate it further. But of course, there is, tons of skepticism about this theory, like, there were no declassified documents that confirm any such test or aircraft. And if it was a secret military craft, it probably wouldn't be tested near a base without, notification to the senior officers. And then the last theory, which is probably the second most popular theory behind it being an actual UFO, is the mass misperception theory. And this theory basically just suggests that the incident was a case of mass misperception, possibly influenced by stress. I mean, this theory is supported by the fact that the Cold War environment created a heightened state of alert and anxiety. The strange light in the forest could have been, misinterpreted, considering it was a dark forest. And maybe once one witness believed that they saw a craft, others could have just unconsciously followed that narrative. But then, to argue this theory, it doesn't explain the radiation readings or the physical indentations. And also, most witnesses, including Halt, maintained their accounts even decades after the incident. So to me personally, I think the theory that this was a genuine alien spacecraft is the most logical, while, looking at the witness statements and all of the evidence. So let me know down in the comments what you guys think the best explanation of the Rendlesham Forest incident is. Was it a UFO? Was it a lighthouse? Were people just tripping? What do you guys think? On the Joe Rogan Experience number 1843, featuring Paul Virzi, Paul tells Joe Rogan about how his father came face to face with a UFO in 1973 in Yonkers, New York. Now, before we hear the story, I want to give you guys some background information about Paul Virzi's father. So Paul's father was born and raised in the Bronx, New York, and came from a Cillian family. Paul's father was described as being very materialistic. He was always dressed up and always wore a fancy watch and fancy shoes. He drove a very nice sports car and was the type of person that believed that they were always right and that everybody else around them was just flat out crazy. From what it sounds like, Paul's father was the type of person to call people out on their bullshit and could spot a liar from a mile away. Now, ever since Paul was a kid, his father has told him a story about when he 100% without a doubt, came face to face with a UFO in Yonkers, New York in 1973. Paul claims that to this day, his father's story has never changed and his father still can't believe what he saw. Now, there is quite a bit of evidence to support Paul's father's story, but before we take a look at the evidence, let's hear the story. Take a listen.
1973, my mother is pregnant with my older brother, Christian. He's 5 years older than me. Okay, so she's pregnant with him. They're outside in Yonkers. There's a little grass lot. And my aunt, grandmother, and mother are out there, and they're screaming, "Tommy, you got to come out here. You got to come out here." So the way my father tells the story, he goes, "I'm watching TV. What the fuck? You know, I don't want to be bothered." He goes, "I go outside," and he said, "Paul," he said, "sitting where I could throw a rock or shoot my gun at it, there is a fucking," and the way he said flying saucer, which is fucking hilarious. But he goes, "It's a fucking flying saucer." He said, "It's got a blue tint around it, little portholes, but you could barely see. Quiet as can be." And he said they were all, and he said the time was weird. The time of night was weird. It was like that weird time where the sun's going down. You don't know. He said the timing of it was weird, and he said his time perception during it was something was off with the time. And he said he said, "Holy shit, I could fucking shoot my gun at this thing." But then he goes, "Then I freaked out because I don't know if this thing's reading my fucking mind, so I went inside." Because he thought that it might have been, so he went inside, he looked again, he went outside, they looked at it, they were stunned, and he said, and like that, it turned into a dot in the sky. He said, like that, it turned into a star, like that. And he says, to this day, exactly the same thing. He goes, "Paul, I always used to think those people were fucking nuts." He goes, "All those people, I thought they were fucking hillbillies somewhere in the Midwest just trying to get attention." He goes, "I know what the fuck I saw." And he goes, "And I wish I didn't see it because I still dream about it and I know what the fuck I saw and I know it wasn't from here." That's 100% true.
Now, what makes Paul's father's story so remarkable is that in 1973, there was a large pattern of UFO sightings across New York. In December of 1973, two women were driving towards Schenectady, New York, which is about 158 miles away from Yonkers, and they allegedly witnessed a massive saucer-shaped object hovering over a General Electric plant. The object was described as being 2 or 3 football fields in diameter, with rotating blue, pink, and yellow lights, which apparently caused the General Electric plant to completely lose all of its power. What's interesting about this sighting is that the women described the saucer as being completely silent and hovering over the ground. Then suddenly it just shot off into the sky. Now, those details are very close to what Paul's father described. Also, similarly, in 1973, 16 witnesses, including a policeman in Gloversville, New York, reported a rotating object in the sky with alternating colored lights. The object hovered over Gloversville, which is about 182 miles away from Yonkers, and then it suddenly shot into the sky. There was also a UFO sighting in October of 1973 in Long Island, New York, just 50 miles away from Yonkers. Amateur astronomers reported observing a yellow-red star-like object while watching meteors near the Naval Weapons Industrial Reserve plant. The plant reported no flights during that time, and the sighting remains completely unexplained. I mean, there were so many UFO sightings in New York in 1973 that they, started to call it the Great UFO Wave of 1973. So Paul's father's story about coming face to face with a UFO in Yonkers in 1973 could very well be true. And if what is said about Paul's father's character is true, I personally think that this story is credible and, pretty believable. Not to mention, there were other family members near Paul's father who also described seeing the exact same thing. But as always, what do you guys think of this story? Do you think that, Paul's father actually came face to face with a UFO, or do you think it's just, a completely made up story? On the Joe Rogan Experience number 2288, featuring Jacques Vallee, Jacques talks to Joe Rogan about overlooked UFO sightings. If you are not familiar with Jacques Vallee, he is one of the most influential figures in the study of UFOs. Early in Vallee's career, he assisted in the first computerized mapping of Mars for NASA, and later at SRI International, he contributed to the development of ARPANET, which is the precursor to the modern internet. Now, his interest in UFOs began when he was young and then eventually turned into a lifelong pursuit. He believes that UFOs may be a part of a broader, multi-dimensional phenomenon. Now, on this episode of the JRE podcast, Jacques tells Joe about 2 different UFO incidents that he was directly involved involved in. Jacques finds these particular incidents astonishing because these incidents weren't investigated by, just random UFO enthusiasts, but actual governments. The first incident that Jacques talks to Joe about is the Lonnie Zamora incident that occurred on April 24th, 1964, near Sirocco, New Mexico. Police officer Lonnie Zamora was pursuing a speeding vehicle on the outskirts of town when he heard a loud roar and saw a bluish-orange flame in the sky to the southwest. Now, Lonnie believed that a nearby dynamite shack may have exploded, so he headed towards that direction to investigate. Now, when he approached the area, he discovered a shiny white egg-shaped object lying on the ground in an arroyo, which is a dry watercourse. Now, at first, Lonnie thought it was an overturned car, but when he went to inspect the object, he noticed two small figures in white coveralls near the object. Then suddenly, the object emitted a loud roar and a flame, then it lifted off into the ground and rapidly ascended into the sky. When fellow officers and investigators arrived at the scene shortly after, they found burned vegetation at the landing site, 4 indentations in the ground, and no footprints or tire tracks leading to or from the site. Now, this incident was investigated by multiple agencies, including the FBI and US Air Force's Project Blue Book. Now, take a listen to Jacques describing the incident.
In Socorro, it was first the local police, local policemen saw the craft and the beings and described what happened. He was terrified, but when the thing took off, he thought it was something to do with some new gadget or some work in the desert. It's an area that's still in the same state today. I've gone back there with Dr. Hynek's son, with Paul Hynek a few months ago. I've gone several times there. And so after the police, turned out the FBI was in town on another case. They had no jurisdiction in New Mexico for that particular case. It wasn't a federal case, but they helped preserve the traces, the FBI way. And the local police was happy to have them there. And then there was the state police came in and did an investigation, and then people from the base, came in with experts in explosives, experts in recovery of weapons and rockets and so on, because they thought it might be something that had come from the Trinity Range that was out of its way, right, and had crashed near Socorro, right, in which case they might have responsibility, including financial responsibility if something was destroyed or whatever. So this was very serious. I have the whole file. Okay, it's a big file. Right. Nobody's looking at it. I mean, the investigation in Washington now, they are saying, we're going to look at the cases of the last 12 months. Well, what kind of science is that? Can you imagine scientists reading this? And this is the way they are going to solve the UFO problem by looking at vague pictures of lights in the sky for 1 year? Why don't they go back to those records? Those are federal records.
Now, the next incident that Jacques talks about is the Valensole UFO incident. So basically at around 5 in the morning on July 1st, 1965, in the village of Valensole in southeastern France, a local farmer named Maurice Massey was tending to his lavender fields when suddenly he heard a high-pitched whistling sound. He went to investigate the noise and he discovered an egg-shaped object with a transparent dome about the size of a small car resting on 6 legs in the middle of his field. Now, near the craft stood 2 small humanoid figures about 4 feet tall. They were dressed in grayish-green, one-piece suits, and they allegedly had large bald heads, elongated ears, and small round mouths. Now, as Maurice approached these beings, one of them pointed a pencil-like device at him, which temporarily paralyzed him, and while Maurice, stood there, frozen, the beings apparently re-entered their craft, which took off with a loud whistling sound and shot into the sky. And about 15 minutes later, Maurice was unparalyzed. Now, just like anyone would be in this situation, Maurice was completely shaken and reported what had just happened to the local gendarme, which is basically France's military force that deals with, law enforcement. Upon arriving at Maurice's lavender fields, investigators found several unusual features at the landing site. There was a circular depression in the soil, and also the nearby lavender plants exhibited signs of decay, and the affected area remained infertile for years. Investigators found no traces of radioactivity, but then when they analyzed the soil, it revealed an unusually high calcium content. Now, some researchers suggested that electromagnetic radiation from the craft could have caused the high calcium content. Take a listen to Jacques Vallee talk to Joe about this incident.
The case in Valence, 5 agencies of the French government. So this guy was a farmer. He had a field where he was growing plants to make perfume. So this was high level, expensive crop. This wasn't just, alfalfa or something. And he goes there at 5 o'clock in the morning because, he wants to do to water the thing and so on before the sun is up, because it's going to be it's in the south of France. It's going to be very hot. You can't work in the field during the early afternoon. So he wants to be done with that. He sees this contraption, in the middle of the field, crushing the plants. And so he sneaks in and he's paralyzed. Okay? Now, there is an egg-shaped object, just like the one, at Trinity, just like the one in Socorro. It's the size of a mid-sized truck. There are 2 creatures in front of it, human looking, 2 eyes, breathing air. They look at him, sort of amused, and one of them has something on his belt. He takes out, pointed at him, and that's when he's paralyzed. Now, he's not, as you know, I'm not a doctor, but I've gone to doctors about what kind of paralysis is that, where you can stand up and watch something, you just can't move. They said, well, there is a type of paralysis that will just inhibit the motor nerves, where but you'll still be up and aware. You're not going to fall down, in a heap. And from there, he sees them going back inside the thing. The thing takes off. It takes off like a shot out of a gun, and it vanishes in midair.
Just like we did previously, I want to go over some of the most common theories surrounding the Valensole UFO incident. I personally think that this incident in particular is pretty fascinating. I mean, you've got a guy who's just, tending to his lavender field and then stumbled across a UFO in the middle of his field, and not just a UFO, but actual aliens. Not to mention that allegedly, these aliens used a device to literally paralyze him. So obviously we have the theory that he did stumble upon a UFO and aliens in that field. And this is just supported because, first off, Maurice was a very credible guy. He was a respected farmer with no history of dishonesty or mental illness. There was also, physical evidence, such as the impressions in the ground, the soil infertility, and also the radiation-like effect on the plants. The second theory is the secret military or experimental craft theory, which basically just suggests that Maurice witnessed a test of an advanced, possibly French or NATO aircraft. This theory is considered because the object's landing gear and mechanical departure might resemble something of a prototype vehicle. The French also had an active aerospace program in the 1960s, and Valensole is not far from those military zones. But this theory is often criticized because there is no known military or civilian aircraft that matches an egg-shaped design or vertical takeoff with no visible propulsion. There are also no records of military activity in Valensole at the time of the incident. Now, the last theory I want to bring up is actually one of Jacques' theories, and he suggests that basically the beings that Maurice encountered were not aliens, but they were actually entities from another dimension or from another reality. He suggests that the UFO may not be a physical spacecraft, but manifestations of phenomena from another dimension or psychological realities that affect the, physical world in strange ways. Kind of a confusing theory, but I just thought I'd bring it up. This theory is rationalized by the beings that were encountered having, behavior that was highly unusual, and their appearance was unusual as well. Now, earlier I said that this incident is so fascinating to me because of just, how almost unbelievable it sounds. Like, researching all of this and, you know, all the different explanations has really left me, I mean, just so confused about what to think. I mean, this is just one of the, you know, small handful of incidents where someone actually came into contact with a being that, you know, wasn't from our Earth. And I mean, hell, I mean, Maurice was literally paralyzed by one of these beings. So as always, I really want to hear what you guys think, you know, is the most rational explanation. Like, do you guys think that Maurice actually came into contact with an alien? You know, did he maybe experience an entity from another dimension or reality? Or was this all just, you know, a made up sort of thing? Let me know down in the comments below. On the Joe Rogan Experience number 2309, featuring Joey Diaz, Joe and Joey discuss the Nixon-Gleason alien encounter and also talk about whether or not the government has alien bodies stored somewhere. But first, let me give you guys some background on the Nixon-Gleason alien encounter. So apparently, sometime between 1973 to 1974, Richard Nixon, who was, you know, the 37th president of the United States, allegedly took Jackie Gleason, who was a famous entertainer and UFO enthusiast, to a secured facility that housed the bodies of aliens. Nixon and Gleason, you know, were known friends. They golfed together, they had mutual respect, and they shared interests. Now, Jackie Gleason was obsessed with UFOs, and Richard Nixon knew that. And according to Beverly McKittrick, which was Jackie Gleason's second wife, Nixon, since he was aware of Jackie's UFO and alien obsession, personally visited him in Florida one evening. Nixon apparently drove Gleason alone without Secret Service to Homestead Air Force Base. At the base, Nixon allegedly showed Gleason a secured facility that housed the bodies of alien beings, allegedly recovered from a crash. Gleason reportedly was shocked, you know, just like any of us would be. The beings were described as being small, child-sized creatures with large heads and strange features. Jackie later told his wife about it, saying that he had trouble sleeping afterward and that it confirmed everything he believed about UFOs. Now, this story first surfaced in 1983, nearly a decade after Nixon resigned, through interviews with Beverly McKittrick. Jackie Gleason himself never publicly confirmed or denied the story, though he reportedly told a few friends and colleagues something similar. Now, Joe and Joey discuss whether or not the government currently has alien bodies in a facility based off of the Nixon-Gleason incident. Take a listen.
They supposedly do have something that crashed, and they supposedly do have biological entities that are on ice somewhere. This is according to these whistleblowers that work for the government, and now we're talking about it. I just don't know what's real. It's hard to know. And you talk about it, you feel like a moron, because it's like...
There's got to be something out there. Okay, we got to assume there's something out there. Whether or not, I don't even know.
Right, but should we assume that something's been here?
Yeah.
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 I think so.
Yeah, they've been here. The moon landing was in 69, so I was 6. So it started after that. Like, I heard more and more about it. So what you mean to tell me is in 55 years we haven't found out more information about it? We know. We know what's going on. We know. NASA's not stupid. They know something's out there. They play with us a little bit from time to time. But there's something out there, my friend.
I think so, too.
There's something out there.
I think the other problem with the president knowing... You know, can they keep things from the president? Of course they can. The president is only there for 4 years. And then he has to get in there again. And if he wins, he's only there for 4 more years. These fucking people have 30-year careers, 50-year careers in the intelligence agencies.
They know.
If they know something, and they've known something since, you know, fucking Gerald Ford, why would they tell you? Why do you need to know?
And
we've already been hiding this from the population for so long.
And those old-timers didn't need what's that when you have to sign something?
NDA?
NDA, like
Yeah.
NAD, whatever the fuck.
Yeah, there was no
like,
NDAs back then.
There's no NDAs back then,
Yeah.
so there was something to it.
Yeah.
There was something to it. You know, you got that place in New Mexico. You got Hudson County, what we discussed before, with the Martians landing. You have all these places that have a higher volume.
This is a very intriguing and also, you know, sort of scary topic to discuss. I mean, even the thought that there is a facility somewhere in the world or the United States or, you know, even multiple facilities that have the bodies of aliens in them is just completely, you know, it's just wild to think about. So let's just like quickly go over some of the key points that support the theory that the government has alien bodies stored somewhere. Now, these are all claims. I just want to get that out of the way. These are claims, not 100% proof, but many people point to the claim that David Grush, who was a former US intelligence officer, testified under oath in 2023 that the government is in possession of non-human biological remains from UFO crash retrievals. Others like Bob Lazar have also claimed to see biological entities at secret sites like Area 51. Also, some people claim that the Roswell incident of 1947 is evidence that the government has recovered alien bodies. And, real quickly, the Roswell incident of 1947 was basically where something crashed on a ranch about, 75 miles north of Roswell, New Mexico. The debris was discovered by a rancher named Mac Brazel, who found strange materials scattered across his property. Mac reported this crash to local authorities, and the Roswell Army Airfield got involved. They made a press release basically saying that they hear the rumors and that it was a flying disc that crashed, and that they said that they were fortunate enough to gain possession of a, flying disc. Then hours later, they basically changed their whole entire story and said it was simply just a weather balloon. So many people think that when the military recovered that disc, they also recovered the bodies of aliens. Pretty freaky shit when you really think about it. As always, what do you guys think? Do you think that, right now, as you guys are watching this video and as I'm, talking, that there are actual alien bodies in a facility somewhere? Crazy to think about. On the Joe Rogan Experience number 1361, Commander David Fravor tells Joe Rogan a story about a guy who saw a UFO underwater, not just once, but twice. Commander David Fravor served in the US Navy for 24 years, including 18 years as a pilot. He was the commanding officer of Strike Fighter Squadron 41, known as the Black Aces, and completed 5 tours in the Persian Gulf. He is also a graduate of the Navy's elite Top Gun Flight School. Now, David Fravor is most commonly known for his involvement in the 2004 USS Nimitz UFO incident, which is, one of the most credible and widely discussed encounters with a UFO. Basically, on November 14th, 2004, during a routine training mission around 100 miles southwest of San Diego, David Fravor and his flight team were tasked to investigate unidentified radar contacts. These contacts were tracked by the USS Princeton for 2 weeks, displaying unusual flight characteristics, including descending from 80,000 feet to 20,000 feet in less than a second. Now, upon reaching the location, David Fravor observed a white, oval-shaped object described as resembling a tic-tac, hovering above a turbulent area of ocean water. The object was estimated to be about 40 feet long. It exhibited no visible means of propulsion, wings, or exhaust. Now, when David Fravor attempted to approach the craft, it mirrored his movements and then accelerated away at an unprecedented speed, disappearing from sight. Now, David Fravor's account gained significant public attention after the Pentagon officially released videos of the encounter. And in July of 2023, Fravor testified before the U.S. House Oversight Committee, asserting that the technology he encountered was far superior than any known human-made aircraft. Now, David Fravor tells Joe a story about when he was working oil and gas, and a guy basically came up to him who knew who he was and told him a story about seeing a mysterious object in the ocean. Take a listen.
So I was working, I still do it, but I was doing oil and gas at the time on a contract, and one of the guys, the story came out, and he was a Navy helicopter pilot. And he comes in, he goes, dude, hey, can I talk to you, man? I go, what about? He goes, dude, I got to talk to you. And I said, what do you want to talk to me about? He says, dude, you know your UFO? He said, yeah. He goes, I had a similar experience. I said, what's that? He said, he was flying CH-53s, which is a big lift, heavy lift that the Marine Corps uses, and the Navy uses it for certain things. And when they go off of, for the East Coast, they do a lot of shooting off of, at the time, it was off of Puerto Rico. We had Roosevelt Roads that they ended up closing. But he was flying out of there. And, you got super clear Caribbean water, and they have these things that are called BQMs. They fly around, and then when they're all done, because they'll fly towards the ships, and the ship can, they can track with the radar. And then they also do, in the ships or submarines shoot torpedoes, they're called telemetry rounds. So they gather all the data on what the torpedo is doing underwater, and then they blow ballast, and this thing will come to the surface and float, and then they go pick them up, and then they can extract all the data out of them. So they do it for both. So he said the first time they're out and they're going to pick up this BQM. And those things, when they're flying, they're done, a parachute comes out and they hook it up. The helo drops the swimmer in the water. He goes and hooks this whole thing up, and then they hoist the whole thing up and fly back, and then they extract the data. So he says he's sitting in the front, in helicopters, there's, a CH-53, you can actually see down by your feet, just like typical, like you go to Hawaii and ride, because you can see when you're touching down. So you got really good visibility out of those things, and you can stick your head out the window too, because you're just kind of hanging out. He says he's going on there and they're getting this thing hooked up. And as he's looking down, because they're, 50 feet above the water, he sees kind of this dark mass coming up from the depths. And they start to hoist the diver up, and they've got the BQM. And as they hoist it up, he says, and he's looking at this thing going, what the hell is that? And then it just goes back down underwater. It just once they pull the kid and the BQM out of the water, this object descends back into the depths. So he thinks, well, that was pretty weird. So he goes out, he says, not too long later, a few months later, he's out and he's picking up a torpedo. So he says they hook the diver up on the winch and they're lowering him in. And as he's looking down, he sees this big, massive, he goes, it's not a submarine. He's seen submarines before. Once you see a submarine, you can't confuse it with something else. This big object, kind of circular, he says, is coming up from the depths. And he starts screaming through the intercom system to tell him to pull the diver up. And the diver's like a few feet from the water. So they reverse the winch, and the diver's thinking, what the hell's going on? And he's getting pulled up, and all of a sudden, he said the torpedo just got sucked down underwater, and the object just descended back down into the depths. And they never recovered the torpedo.
Jesus.
And this happened in the late 90s.
Commander David Fravor's story about an underwater UFO isn't the first time that something like that has been reported. In 2013 in Aguadilla, Puerto Rico, a UFO was recorded by a U.S. Customs and Border Protection aircraft using an infrared camera. The object was first seen flying at low altitude over the Rafael Hernandez Airport, then passed over the ocean and entered the water without any splash or slowing down. Then when it entered the water, the object appeared to split into two separate entities, both continuing to move underwater. Now to this day, the government has not offered any sort of explanation, and the video is considered one of the most credible USO, or unidentified submerged object pieces of footage to date. In 2019, the USS Omaha, a US Navy ship, detected a spherical object on its radar. It was also captured on video by sailors using a thermal imaging device. The object was tracked moving at high speeds and hovering before it dove into the Pacific Ocean with, again, no splash. Now, the Navy tried to search for this object, but they recovered nothing. There was no debris, there was no object, and there was no sign of any impact. The footage was later released by filmmaker Jeremy Corbell and was confirmed as real by the Pentagon. And then just for fun, there was also allegedly multiple underwater interactions with USOs in Russia in the 1980s. Russian military divers reported encounters with gigantic underwater aircrafts and humanoid beings in Lake Baikal, which is the world's deepest freshwater lake. Apparently, in one incident, the objects were seen moving beneath the surface at speeds impossible for known submarines, then shooting up into the sky. Reports were so strange that, some of the Soviet files remained classified for decades. But these Russian divers were, probably just drunk off of vodka and, just seeing things. And yes, that was a joke. But in all seriousness, I think it's incredible interesting that most of these incidents where USOs were observed, that they all pretty much shared the same characteristics. I think the biggest one is that these crafts could enter and exit the water without breaking the water. I mean, this could be due to some type of, hydrodynamic displacement control. Like the USO could manipulate the water around it to minimize resistance and surface disruption. And as we all know, UFOs, or I guess in this case, USOs, are known to have technology that, isn't from this earth. So yeah, makes sense why we wouldn't know how they can enter and exit water without making a splash. But anyways, these have been 5 of the craziest alien stories ever told on the Joe Rogan Experience Podcast. Now, if you guys enjoyed, please be sure to leave a like and subscribe with post notifications on. And without further ado, I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. I will see you guys the next one. Peace out.